deliver.
Thank you. We'll go up first of all to Mr. Erskine-Smith for 7 minutes.
Thanks very much, and thank you everyone for coming today. I want to start by asking about the resignations and just give an opportunity to provide some context and what's happened, why the resignations, and the aftermath of the resignations, what steps have taken place.
Could you clarify which, in particular, the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel resignations, or?
Yeah, specifically with respect to privacy and Ms. Kavukian, but also I understand there was another person as well.
Yes, okay.
So for the DSAP resignations, those happened very early in the process of the committee getting set up, before real work had gotten underway and before we had certainly had any grist in the mill, if you will, for the committee to begin to think through what the main issues were. The committee now is very well guided by Dr. Geist's leadership, and we have a vice chair from IBI Group, Charles Finley, who was one of the co-founders of Code for Canada. We have also just completed a recruitment for new panelists, which had a very warm kind of reception in from the community. So we're in the process of selecting 3 new panelists. It's unfortunate we actually lost some very valuable perspectives when those resignations occurred that certainly have extremely valuable sort of contributions to this conversation that we're having around smart cities. And we're still hopeful that we'll be able to engage those individuals in the conversation moving forward.
I appreciate that. So I understand, and I hope it's not a problem anymore, but I wanted to drive at this idea of de-identification. So this notion that information collected through whatever sensors, I know there are a couple examples in Sidewalk Labs' most recent information. If it's de-identified at source and there's a commitment to de-identification and openness by default, I understand there was the dispute at the time was that de-identification was not to be mandatory. Can you speak to the current state of affairs?
Absolutely. Immediately, actually, after that meeting, Dr. Kavuki and I had a follow-up meeting, and we had a very candid conversation. The actual question was about what was the definition of at source. Was it at the point of collection, at the initial point of storage or processing? We certainly came to a very good understanding of what was meant, which is why we're comfortable in making that very firm commitment now from Waterfront Toronto. We've also had further conversations with one of Canada's leading researchers that look at de-identification of data to understand exactly what the implications were from both the sort of security perspective, the privacy perspective, and also ensuring that we weren't precluding Canadian firms from having access to the technology that they would need at an affordable basis to do that de-identification. So all of those factors were able to be satisfied, and that's why we're able to make that commitment to de-identification today.
Can you give us an example then? So I'm walking through this 12-acre project when it's developed, or I'm driving through it. How is my personal information collected? At what point is the information de-identified? And provide me some example and then some assurance, hopefully.
So some of that will need to come from Sidewalk Labs when they're here in front of you with regards to some of the specific solutions that they're suggesting, since they are providing some of the technologies or have been talking to the technology companies more directly than we have at this point in time. However, if we take the situation of looking at some of the pedestrian counting or traffic counting that would typically happen, whether it be in the Quayside project or in other urban environments, what is being proposed is that immediate upon collection, rather than having an image captured, you would be converted into a shape. And that shape would actually be non-specific enough so that you wouldn't be able to determine gender, age, whether or not you have a difference of abilities, and so on, so that you're actually just becoming a number, an algorithm, if you will, in the whole perspective. So from the moment of collection, you're nothing more than essentially a variable statistic in an algorithm.
When you mentioned, I think Ms. Davis, you mentioned that the data governance plan will be made public soon.
Actually, the Master Innovation and Development Plan, the MIDP, we have not yet received it from Sidewalk. We've seen dribs and drabs, but we haven't seen a full proposal. Understand their plans are not finalized yet. We expect to see that very soon. And that will be taken to our government partners through our Intergovernmental Steering Committee, which has representations from all 3 levels of government. And then it will be offered up to the public for input, and that input will need to be demonstrated how it's reflected in the final MIDP that is given to Waterfront Toronto from Sidewalk to evaluate.
But I understand from your opening comments, at least, so when Sidewalk Labs in October 2018 publishes the digital governance proposals for DSAP consultation, and they include in their principles of de-identification and open by default, those are two core principles that Waterfront Toronto will require as mandatory for any for the project to proceed.
Correct.
Is that fair to say?
In that case, those principles that they're putting forward are consistent with Waterfront Toronto's approach for the project as well. The Master Innovation and Development Plan will have an entire chapter and potentially some resources associated with the notion around digital innovations and the urban data question. So that will be further built out throughout that piece for their evaluation as well.
And I'm not completely familiar with all of the public consultations that have taken place. I know that some people have raised concerns, but you've noted just now that when the master plan is released publicly, there will then be continued consultations?
Yes, that's correct. Waterfront Toronto will conduct additional consultations. City of Toronto will conduct its own consultations as well. So we anticipate, as we do with all of our projects at Waterfront Toronto, very deep consultation with the community.
Perhaps I just have two more questions. One is, can you respond to the Ontario Attorney General and indicated that there was preferential treatment by Waterfront Toronto of Sidewalk Labs? Can you speak to that?
Well, and I think the Auditor General didn't actually say there was preferential treatment. I think she said there was a risk. Waterfront Toronto conducts its RFP process very independently. It was an independent RFP process governed by a Fairness Commissioner. We had Justice Coulter Osborne as our Fairness Commissioner. We conducted a RFP process called market sounding, which is very typical for complex RFP processes where we meet with a lot of companies. We met with over 50 companies, most of whom we met with before we'd ever met with Sidewalk. And we had discussions with a lot of other interested parties, et cetera, beforehand. And I think the Auditor General also says the process was a bit too short. And in fact, it was 159 days. It's the second longest procurement that we've had at Waterfront Toronto. We had 6 proponents, 3 were shortlisted, and none of the proponents that were shortlisted asked for any additional, in fact, none of the proponents asked for additional time. So in fact, the process was, we felt very robust and appropriate for what we were asking for, which is, again, to prepare a plan. It's not, there's no transaction of land, there's no development happening. This is just a plan for us to think about.
I think I'm out of time, but I look forward to asking about data trusts when I get another opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to you all for attending today. And I'd like to pick up on that last point. But before I get to my questions, I just want to do a little bit of a scene set recap of the chain of events. And I think it's fair to say it's not surprising that there's a widespread belief that a political fix of sorts has been in for Sidewalk Labs' preferential treatment since Justin Trudeau met with Alphabet's former chair Eric Schmidt at the Google Go North Summit in 2017. And then, as you've just referenced, after Waterfront Toronto chose Sidewalk Labs to develop a data-driven neighborhood in a process that the Auditor General, I believe, did question as preferential and certainly rushed. One of the Liberal government's top infrastructure operatives, the infrastructure minister's former chief of staff and a longtime friend of the former PMO principal secretary, Mr. John Broadhead, was installed in a senior management position. And then, after those, I think, very notable resignations from Sidewalk Labs' associated panel over the secrecy and the privacy issues, we suddenly discovered last week that far from a relatively compact 12-acre digital neighborhood, Google's plan, or Sidewalk Labs, Alphabet's plan, is for the entire 350 acres of Toronto's Portlands. Those leaked documents basically indicated that Sidewalk Labs wants, in return for its investment in the 12 acres, a share of all eventual development fees across the Dockland and property taxes on appreciating land values as a result of the Quayside project, apparently in perpetuity. So I think my first question would begin, do you believe that after these revelations, which the Toronto Mayor's Office, Toronto Council were unaware, the Premier's Office, the Cabinet was unaware, that the original RFP and agreement that was subsequently signed is still valid?
Yes, I do. And the reason I say that is we ran an independent process. It was guided by, as I said, the former Integrity Commissioner, Justice Coulter Osborne. It was also guided by a steering committee, not Waterfront Toronto's board. These were independent individuals. We had 3 external subject matter experts on that steering committee. The evaluation team was Waterfront Toronto staff, and we also had support from some external subject matter experts that included KPMG, Canadian Urban Institute. Those evaluations were not done by our board or by any politicians or any sort of political operatives or bureaucrats. There was no interference in that process. Sidewalk Labs was chosen through a very, very rigorous process, evaluation criteria that were signed off by the Justice Coulter Osborne, and also with legal opinions from Denton's, from McCarthy's. This process was as independent as any of the others that we've run, and we've run hundreds of them at Waterfront Toronto. So the selection of Sidewalk Labs, in my mind, was absolutely appropriate. They provided the best proposal of the shortlisted proponents.
But do you understand why people and politicians in the GTA in Toronto and beyond, to Ottawa, see this suddenly as more of a high-profit real estate property development project than a technology partnership?
So if we look back at the RFP, we didn't specifically ask for technology. We really were looking for, let me take a quick step back. Waterfront Toronto's mandate is to bring economic development, private sector investment, innovation, all to the waterfront and use that as an economic engine. And in so doing, if you take a step back 10 years ago, we, for example, having the ability to transform the market and have sort of effective leadership of public lands. We don't own all of it. A lot of it's owned by the city. We set a standard, for example, in sustainability of LEED Gold. I don't know, people may not know much about that, but it's an international standard of sustainability that a building must meet, and there's a whole process that needs to be gone through, and it's third-party adjudicated. That was transformational at the time. 10 years ago, people said, you've got to be kidding me. We now have development partners of ours, Tridel, for example, who is building LEED Platinum on one of our projects without even being asked to do so. So that's kind of table stakes now. When we looked at Quayside, the 12 acres is owned primarily by Waterfront Toronto. There's a very small portion that the city owns and a small portion that is owned by the public sector or private sector. We said to ourselves, what can we do that's different? We've got an affordability crisis in Toronto. We are dangerously close to a sustainability crisis, climate change. Mobility, the congestion in Toronto is unbearable. It takes me over an hour every day to get to work on the subway. So what can we do as a public agency of all 3 levels of government, and with this land that we own, to push the envelope again and to really raise the bar on all of these elements? So we put out an RFP for a thinking partner and somebody who might have some money to help us do some research and development. So when we were looking for the innovation and funding partner, it is not a development proposal. The intention in the RFP and reflected in the plan development agreement, which is the agreement we have now with Sidewalk, is to come up with these ideas and standards so that we can then engage the Toronto or international development community to help us build out the Quayside property. And the other thing the RFP and the plan of development agreement allow is for thinking at scale. So if we wanted to get to climate neutral or carbon neutral or climate positive, what would we have to do to get there? 12 acres isn't probably going to get you there. You need districts, energy systems, you need different electric grids, you need transportation systems, etc. What would it take to get to some of the objectives, these very lofty objectives that Waterfront Toronto set? And so the RFP and the plan development agreement allowed the proponent, the successful proponent, to think at scale, to think bigger, think beyond Quayside, to come up with some ideas. innovative funding ideas around transit, for example. We do have a transit need in the waterfront. We've had one for a very long time. The city has identified it as a priority, but the city has a lot of priorities. So we were looking for innovative opportunities in order to help fund a Waterfront Toronto LRT system. So in fact, I am surprised that people think that there was some sort of fix in. This is what Waterfront Toronto was set up to do. We ran a process like all the other processes that we run, and we selected an innovative thinking partner who also agreed to spend $50 million thinking about things and suggesting ideas to us. The other thing I'd like to say about the fix being in is that we haven't even seen the proposal yet. We've seen little pieces. We've all seen what was in the paper last week. But we don't have a final proposal that brings together all of the innovations, the financials, all of that. We are going to go through an incredibly rigorous evaluation process that will include all of our government partners. Through our Intergovernmental Steering Committee, we will spend a lot of time analyzing that proposal. So we haven't offered anything to anyone. Sidewalk doesn't have rights to land. We haven't transferred any land. Most of those lands are owned by the city. The city will have to be the decider on whether or not there are any property taxes provided to Sidewalk or anything, or development charges. All of those things are yet to come and to be discussed and to be debated in the public forum.
Time's up.
Thank you, Mr.
We'll come back.
Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Angus.
Thank you. I'm so pleased you're here. I only have 7 minutes, so I'm not going to sound rude, but I'm going to have to get a few more questions in, so we'll be moving along. I mean, I think the development of the waterfront is crucial for Toronto, and I see what's happening in New York and Brooklyn for creating innovative public spaces is really important. But what we were told in that RFP was 12 acres, and now we learned from the Toronto Star that it's for the whole waterfront. Why was that not made clear in the RFP?
I think, as I just mentioned, the RFP actually says to think about Quayside and to think about solutions at scale. So transit at scale, district systems at scale, innovative financing options at scale, and that the designated waterfront area was actually, in fact, the area in which Waterfront Toronto has its purview. So
Had the first map was the 12-acre for the Quayside, but then when you did the plan development agreement, it was for the whole designated waterfront area. Isn't that rather unusual when we're talking about probably the most valuable real estate in North America, that here's the deal, it's only 12 acres, but then once we're moving down the road, it's actually the whole thing? I mean, people who bid on that were thinking it was only 12 acres. So was that an understanding from the get-go that you allowed another map in that was the whole waterfront?
I can't be certain, but the RFP, I think, does have a map of the entire waterfront, and that is the designated waterfront area that's in the plan development agreement is the geographic area that applies to Waterfront Toronto.
The RFP was said very clearly, the RFP is for Quayside development. And yet, when it came out with the last summer, the agreement included the full map. So that's the question. So if this is a rigorous process, it was only a 6-week RFP, 10 weeks to do public art installations on the waterfront. The Auditor General has said that Sidewalk Labs received more information from Waterfront Toronto prior to the RFP. They raised questions that the board was not given much time to actually review this. So you tell us it's a rigorous process, but the Auditor General found that this thing was really pushed through quickly.
Okay, so I feel like there were sort of maybe 3 or 4 points in there, and I'd like to try and manage each one of them separately.
RFP.
Sorry?
I was just helping you.
Is that
6
the
weeks.
first one
Yeah,
you'd
yeah.
like me? Okay. Yeah. So the RFP was actually 159 days. I think I mentioned that already. And in fact, it's the second longest RFP that we've ever run at Waterfront Toronto. It is a 2-staged RFP process, and none of the bidders in the first part or in the second part asked for any extensions. We often give extensions if people are asking. We sought guidance from our external legal, from our procurement advisors, and from our own experience. And 159 days we think was sufficient.
59 days.
That's
'cause
correct.
What we've been told is 6 weeks. So
That's not correct.
okay, so that's good to know. Now, the Investment and Real Estate Committee did not recommend this project.
So
But then it was passed to the board who was only given one business day to approve on October 13th. But then we're told that the day before they'd already had the announcement ready that the Prime Minister, the Premier, the Mayor, and Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs was signing the deal. So if the Real Estate Committee did not recommend this project, if you have rigorous oversight, why was this flagged ahead?
So what I will say is that the IREC, which is our Investment and Real Estate Committee, it's kind of like saying that a third reading of a bill is rushed when committee has had it for weeks and has reviewed every clause, every comma, and has been helping the team negotiate. So IREC, in fact, had at least 6 meetings prior to the board meeting where the board voted with only one dissenting vote, I might add.
Did not recommend it.
IREC did not recommend it. The board does, but IREC doesn't approve. They take things forward to the board, and the board determined that it would vote on the document because the rigorous analysis had been done. IREC had reviewed all of the document and had, given guidance to the negotiating team, the staff, all the way through the process. And in fact, they had been part of the RFP process all the way through the IREC committee.
They're the review committee. And now we learn from the Toronto Star, and they talk about how if this moves forward, it will move a large recurring revenue stream being diverted from the city into private hands, which was not in the original RFP. You're saying you're talking about economies of scale. But the Real Estate Committee said no to this, and so it went ahead anyways. The Auditor General said that Sidewalk Labs was giving more information than their competing bids. The Auditor General says that they were given just a weekend to discuss and understand the implications of the initial framework agreement before being asked to approve it. So my question is, was the Auditor General wrong? Was she reading something else?
No, I would say that the experience that we have had at Waterfront Toronto was that the due diligence was done at the committee level. The board was briefed, and all the way along through the process. They also did get 2 briefings on the framework agreement. The other thing to mention about the framework agreement, and if there was something I'd like to learn from this process, is that the agreement we have today with Sidewalk is the one we should have started with. We probably should have done a different agreement right at the beginning. That agreement was just to get us to do the next agreement, which was the PDA. So it had no handcuffs for our board or for governments. It didn't require us to stay in the deal. We could walk away at any time.
The Auditor General found internal Waterfront Toronto emails that, quote, the board felt it was being urged strongly by the federal and provincial governments to approve and authorize the framework agreement with Sidewalk Labs as soon as possible. So if they were under pressure to approve this deal, your Real Estate Committee was saying no. The Auditor General was feeling that there was a number of other questions. How was that framework agreement handled with absolute vigor and rigorous review if the board felt it was being pushed into making this decision?
So 2 things I want to say about that. One is the board did vote. There was only one dissenting vote. So the board was actually fine with the agreement. And there's a first point that you mentioned.
IREC actually didn't say no. They just deferred it to the board.
Oh, they deferred it to the board. No, I'm sorry. I'll come back to it. There was another point that you made there that I wanted to respond to. No, sorry. I mentioned the board. The board did have briefings, and they did vote with only one dissenting opinion or a dissenting vote. So they were actually fine with the agreement.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Angus. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Saney.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to defer or give my time to Mr. Vaughan.
Thanks so much. Just to review the history of Waterfront Toronto, when was it started?
2001.
And that was when Mayor David Miller, a New Democrat, Mayor David Miller, and the then Prime Minister and Premier put together a development corporation on the waterfront?
Yes. I mean, I actually have in front of me the Crombie Commission, 30 years in the making. So it was, I think, in response to an Olympic bid. I wasn't at the corporation at the time. And with that failed Olympic bid, they determined that there was enough work and enough sort of energy there to put together a corporation to guide waterfront revitalization.
And the structure of the board is 4 federal appointees, 4 provincial appointees, 4 city appointees and a provincially appointed chair.
That's correct.
So the province holds effectively the most seats, but no one level of government holds the majority of seats.
No one level of government holds the majority of seats.
And in terms of the waterfront properties, how much land does Waterfront Toronto actually own and have title to?
We own about 12 acres, just under 12 acres.
Which is about 1% of the entire parcel.
That's correct.
So all of the city-owned land is still governed by city laws, city
Absolutely.
requirements, and city approval processes.
Absolutely.
So you can't, for example, Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto can't assign tax dollars to a private corporation without the city's consent.
That's correct.
And
Nor can we sell city land without their permission.
And nor can you zone or approve any particular project without city approval.
That's correct.
And all
we don't have zoning authority.
And all zoning authority is governed by the Provincial Planning Act?
Yes, correct.
Which means that any proposal you receive, even if you approve it, still requires city and provincial government approval.
And I would say probably some federal government approval on certain aspects as well.
When it's federally owned land.
On federally owned land, or if there's something that's being requested that affects a federal piece of legislation.
And is there any provision in your corporate construction or corporate documents that allows you to override or be exempt from City of Toronto regulations around privacy and data, provincial privacy laws, or any federal laws that are put in place? Is there anything that exempts Waterfront Toronto from the legal regime that governs data in this country?
Absolutely not.
And are you allowed to write corporate contracts that exempt you or grandfather certain laws to be exempt from any changes in any laws that occur?
No.
And you would agree that if there are Canadian laws put in place to govern how data is collected, whether through open or regulated processes, or shared through open regulated processes, or stored in any regulated processes, that you will have to comply with all federal, provincial, and city laws. You have no ability to operate outside those rules.
That's absolutely correct.
Okay. In terms of the proposal that has been released to the newspaper, is that a proposal that's being shared with Waterfront Toronto?
Waterfront Toronto has seen elements of that, not all of it, and we certainly haven't seen a full proposal. And as you said, that is a proposal, and we will evaluate it along with our government partners.
Somebody said this morning that there was a rush. This deal has been rushed. Has there been a deal reached yet?
No, no.
How
We
do you-
are only at the very early stages, in fact.
How do you rush a deal that hasn't been made?
It's not rushed.
So
We're
the deal-
working very hard, and we're doing very deep analysis, so no, we're not rushing.
Okay, and in terms of now, there have also been suggestions that this is a federal government project, and that our government brought you this project. Who reached out to Google first? When did you first become aware that Google was interested in property or a project on the waterfront?
Me personally, I was not in the first round. A fellow in our office used to work for the City of New York, and I think he reached out to, there's an email in the auditor's report where he reached out to his previous boss and said, here you guys are doing some interesting things. We're doing some market sounding. We'd love to hear what you're doing.
Did the federal government bring you Google?
No. Not
Did anybody in the Prime Minister's office bring you Google?
No, we've had no contact with the Prime Minister's
Did the local
office.
MP bring you Google?
No.
Thank you. In terms of how this process is going forward, whatever development agreement you reach on the 12-acre piece of land, is that subject to full city scrutiny?
Absolutely. We will have to go through all rezoning, committee of adjustment, building permits, all of that.
And if you're to use city property like roads or public spaces that are currently part of that project and run through that project, will it require full City of Toronto consent before any infrastructure attached to the rest of the public infrastructure is touched?
Absolutely, through the subdivision process, and that's what we always do.
So you can't place one single sensor on any infrastructure without City of Toronto approval?
That's correct.
And you have a City of Toronto councillor on your board now, do you
Yes,
not?
we do.
And so that City of Toronto councillor is the only politician who sits on the board?
Yes, that's correct.
I recognize that in the past it's been Joe Pantalone.
That's correct.
David Miller has sat on that board. Now it's currently Joe Cressy.
That's correct.
Right, and that person will also have carriage of that issue at City Council.
That's correct.
Okay. In terms of that process as it moves forward, is there anything the federal government can do to override city zoning?
And to my knowledge, no. I think the planning comes to the Planning Act, so it's a provincial statute. So I don't think there's a federal.
So
override.
only the provincial government can declare a provincial interest. The federal government has no planning authority over any of this.
I think that's correct, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm a planner, but
From
not
my
a lawyer.
experience as a city councillor, that's entirely true. In terms of the Auditor General's report, one of the things the Auditor General report doesn't like about the configuration of Waterfront Toronto is that it has to be subjected to City of Toronto rules, regulations, and Canadian law. They would like it actually to see it exempt from City of Toronto law so that you had a free hand to develop this without any oversight.
Sorry, can you say the first part of the
The
question
Auditor
again? I'm sorry.
General, Auditor General recommends and suggests that it would be better if you had full control over all waterfront development and you weren't subjected to City of Toronto guidelines. Is that not one of her findings?
I think one of her findings is she was comparing us to the Forks Corporation in Winnipeg that does have those powers. When Waterfront Toronto was formed, we looked at a lot of different agencies, and we have the powers that we have, and it does not include that, so no.
Two of the checks and balances on Waterfront Toronto activities were explicitly asked for by the City of Toronto and the Province of Ontario. One was that the Province of Ontario be the controlling legislator on this. In other words, you're a creature of the province because you're a product of provincial legislation, not federal legislation. And secondly, the City of Toronto refused to surrender final say on all planning and infrastructure investments.
That's correct.
And in terms of this leaked document that suggests that perhaps Google would build the LRT and then recoup its costs through tax, taking a slice of the taxes, a slice of development charge, and a slice of property lift on adjoining properties, the City of Toronto would have to consent to that 100%. They have full control over that, over whether you could even entertain such an agreement.
Absolutely, and I think the province would have a say too because the tax increment financing is a provincial legislation. That's correct.
And as it stands right now, the preferred option of the City of Toronto is for the TTC and the City of Toronto to build the LRT, nobody else, only public transit built by public authorities by the City of Toronto. That is the position of Waterfront Toronto, and that's the position of the City of Toronto.
I think that's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Okay, next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Gord.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is for Mr. Leduc. You represent many companies in the new digitized world, that era, and of course the government of Canada intends to provide digitized services to Canadians. There are Chinese companies that operate with the cloud, and you're aware of the situation with Huawei. There are countries that are prohibiting or in the process of prohibiting Huawei's business in their country. How can you say that we would be secure with this type of technology if it were to be used? At present, Huawei is not a member of our association, and we reserve any comment about the technology of a company that is not a member of our association. It doesn't want to be a member, or it hasn't shown any interest in becoming a member? No, not to date. So you don't want to make any comment about the technology of the future. Well, some technology of the future, but not on Huawei. These new cloud computing capacities, is this something, this new capability and technology, this is important. The new 5G is a telecommunications technology. It's required to be able to transmit data. So the volume of data that is going to be transmitted through our networks, the networks at the present time currently are not able to do that. There are sensors that are in smart cities or through the highways. 5G is a prerequisite for this type of smart technology, smart city, and a smart network. The opportunity really for 5G is the application. It will allow for new and interesting innovation to be made. Yes, we talk about the intelligent highway in the future. where there'll be increasingly sensors on cars, on any type of vehicle, that will be able to probably become a very big market. But how are you going to reassure Canadians? Will it be safe for Canadians? Because for each car, if you look at it, it's going to take a very, very long time to develop that. Yes, well, like Meg said, really, it's data, very often data that is anonymous. Other times, we might just record the license number of a car, of a vehicle. Other times, it might be different from the way in which we collect information today. It will depend on who is, say, the owner of the automobile or the truck that will be digitized using that highway. So sharing that information, because the information between the trucks and the infrastructure, or the vehicle and the infrastructure, will be transmitted in terms of the capability. Is this being a future project, is it being founded on a secure basis? Oh, yes, doubtless. There are a lot of members who are working on 5G development, members who are working on the software for the development to be used in cars. That's tomorrow's world. Is technology bringing about more change than, shall we say, Canadians would like to see, quicker than Canadians would like to see that change happen in a variety of sectors? I think it's the inverse, quite the contrary. Is products, technological solutions, all of that forces suppliers to develop new innovations to provide for Canadians. So Canadians and North Americans just love new technology. And these markets exist already. So there's a cost-benefit side to all of this, right? In terms of adapting smart technology, Canada lags behind, according to the United Nations, lags behind South Korea and Australia. In terms of our citizens adopting this new technology, embracing it, we are ranked third. How much time do I have left? Thank you.
Ms. Vanderbilt, for 5 minutes.
I'd like to give my time to Mr. Vaughn, please.
Okay. Mr. Vaughn.
There is no governance data structure.
Sorry, point of order?
Yes, Mr. Angus.
Well, I just think it should be on the record for a government that says they're not running it at the highest level. They have their parliamentary secretary at the table, which is not it's how it's supposed to be done. The parliamentary secretary can be as an observer, so I just think that should be on the record.
If I could just note that I'm giving the time to the person who's the local MP in the area that we're discussing.
Yeah, I don't believe it's a point of order, but fair enough. Mr. Vaughn.
Appreciate that the NDP doesn't want the local member of parliament to talk about issues in his riding, but I will not be silenced by that. The issue that I think is important to the waterfront, as someone who has been both a city councillor and now the federal member, as well as a resident and someone who's lived all their life in the downtown core, is that Waterfront Toronto enjoys a reputation for extensive, effective, and very well attended public consultation on all of its projects.
That's correct. Waterfront Toronto.
In fact, it's held up in the city of Toronto as hosting the most public of all consultations, and as often it makes significant changes to its projects based on the way in which public presentation and impact, everything from the BIA to the Port Authority to local residents associations speak up.
That's correct.
On the issue of the data governance plan, does the City of Toronto have a current framework that governs the collection of data through infrastructure? For example, the Presto card or the library card, or the way in which people who call 311 and dial in through Facebook, whether their information is shared publicly. Do they have a data governance and a data sharing and a data collection open by government plan that currently regulates how data is embedded in infrastructure?
The City of Toronto doesn't have a comprehensive data governance plan at the present time. And as a matter of fact, it was just yesterday that we learned of a motion that was going forward to City Council by Councillor Cressy to bring forward the notion of the CIO's office being tasked with preparing a data governance strategy writ large around all of the major infrastructure issues that are underway. There are things like their open data governance framework piece and so on. So there's bits and pieces, but not one comprehensive approach around all of the notions of data that would be collected in a smart city.
Even though their infrastructure is currently embedded with data collection sensors.
That's correct.
Right. And in terms of the high watermark around this, Barcelona is often held as the city whose data governance model is the best in class. Have you looked at the Barcelona model?
Yes, we've been looking at many of the different models around the world, Barcelona, Estonia, Amsterdam, and certainly the Barcelona model is an exemplar of how to build data governance from the community level up. They have a very passionate CIO who has very much looked at the human rights components and digital justice components regarding data governance and has done a fantastic job with preparing that and also disseminating it globally.
And it's compliant with the best regional data governance model, which is the European Common Market. The EU's data governance model is seen as the highest and best in class globally as a way of managing public data and orchestrating how data is both collected, distributed, shared, and commercialized.
That's correct.
And would you be comfortable with the proposal as it's currently being configured, even though it hasn't been approved, but would you be comfortable if the federal government, provincial government, and city governments imposed those standards on Toronto, would the project be possible?
So I would need to go through each individual component of the proposal to do a very thoughtful review of how each of those things would be impacted from the imposition of those. But at this very high level, I would say yes, absolutely, we would be comfortable with that moving forward in that kind of mechanism. The highest order of privacy.
Waterfront Toronto has no objection to a Barcelona-style data system governance being imposed by the City of Toronto across the entire city, and you would comply with that as an agency in the city.
Absolutely.
In terms of some of the opposition to this project, Jim Basile said to me in my office when I took a meeting with him, because I meet with all sides in this conversation, said that he would throw Waterfront in Toronto in front of Google to stop Google, that the issue here isn't Waterfront Toronto, it's Google. Do you share that perspective? Have you heard it before, and do you share that perspective as being a reasonable one?
I haven't heard that perspective. I know that Mr. Basile oftentimes talks about the value of IP, which we recognize is extraordinary, and the potential for that through this project, both in terms of Google-related IP or Sidewalk-related IP that could be generated, but also the IP that could be generated from local Canadian firms. I've not heard that analogy, but I do know that Mr. Basile has some very passionate thoughts about this project.
And when he says that Waterfront Toronto doesn't have the capacity to build the waterfront, what experience does he have with land use development corporations?
To the best of my knowledge, none.
He agreed with you. The other thing that I think is critical to understand here is that this development proposal, and I will say it again, there's no finished deal. Whatever deal Waterfront Toronto Board, which is made up of as many city, provincial, and federal members as one other, 4, 4, and 4 with the provincial appointee, whatever deal that they make still must be ratified by the City of Toronto, the government of the City of Toronto at City Hall.
Yes, most of the lands are owned by the city, so yes, that's correct.
And so nothing can happen without city consent.
That's correct.
No matter who talks to Waterfront Toronto, it's the publicly elected officials at the City of Toronto who have the final say on this project.
That's correct.
Okay, and to be very clear about this, did the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office, or any federal Liberal bring this project to you and ask for you to approve it?
Absolutely not.
When you meet with federal MPs, why do you meet with them?
We meet frequently with federal, provincial MPs, with our local councillors, et cetera, to give them updates on waterfront projects as they go forward across the waterfront.
Have any members of the opposition parties asked for a briefing?
Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. That's time. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. And just to be very clear, I believe that Waterfront Toronto is a wonderful organization with a terrific history, but given the secrecy and the initial statement by Mr. Doktorov, give us a city to run, that there is some suspicion, there's widespread suspicion. The last week, the social media has been alive. Certainly, I've talked to councillors, I've talked to MPPs in the provincial legislature who are very worried that Waterfront Toronto, a worthy organization with decades of worthy goals for the Toronto waterfront, is being steamrollered by a Google sibling. And The parliamentary secretary may not have been following this committee's work for the past year since the Cambridge Analytica Facebook aggregate IQ scandal, but in the testimony that we've taken, we have learned some very serious and in some cases very disturbing truths about the dataopolies, including the Google family. So I hope that you understand that that is the impression, and I understand also, and I don't know if it's true, and I'd like to ask you to speak to it. Waterfront Toronto, I'm told, the staff of Waterfront Toronto and its various internal divisions, the mood is not good because of the overwhelming preoccupation of the Sidewalk Labs project. Now, could you address that? Is that a wrong impression?
Well, first of all, I'm gonna let Christina talk about the sort of accountability framework that will be in place. But I know I go to work every day excited by not just the sidewalk, the Quayside project, and what we might be able to achieve on affordability, sustainability, and mobility. Christina looks after the tech part. So I'm excited to go to work every day. People are very enthusiastic. I know that there are some folks out there who are very, concerned about the project. We're concerned about data and privacy like everybody else, but we're also enthusiastic. And there are a lot of people who come to our public engagement and roundtables, et cetera, who are enthusiastic and want to see where this might go. So we also have a lot of other projects that we're working on. We have flood protection, which this government has very graciously given us $400 million to do. So we're enthusiastic about all those projects as well. Do you want to talk about the...
So I'd actually like to touch on two elements of your comment. The first is with regards to the dataopolies. So in my, if you will, my spare time, I'm still a sessional instructor in the School of Computer Science at the University of Windsor. So I actually teach both a social media technology kind of course as well as a cyber ethics course. So I am very well aware of the risk of the dataopolies and what that represents nationally and internationally. And in fact, the accountability framework that we will be moving into if we put forward any of these ideas into an implementation plan will ensure that we actually prevent against the dataopolies having effective control over too much of the data or not sharing the data.
If I could just interrupt there.
Sure.
Sidewalk Labs has been very secretive or obfuscating with regards to who will own the data that they generate within Quayside, whether that data will be shared with Canada or whether, in fact, Sidewalk Labs, by accumulating this data, by commercializing this data, will take it from the country and profit below. And I think that's behind, and the parliamentary secretary invoked Mr. Balsily's name, but I think that's behind Mr. Balsily's statement, and he says that as long as Waterfront defers to Sidewalk on all of the critical decisions, Canadians will be treated to glitzy images of pseudo-tech dystopia while foreign companies profit from the IP and data Canadian taxpayers fund and create. He says Sidewalk Toronto is not a smart city, it is a colonizing experiment in surveillance capitalism attempting to bulldoze important urban, civic, and political issues. Do you disagree?
I disagree with Mr. Balsily on that front. Actually, Sidewalk has been pretty clear in the fact that they don't intend to own the data, and they do intend to make all of the data open by default, which is an interesting business model in the fact that it actually doesn't have monetization behind it in the traditional sense. That being said, some of the smaller Canadian firms may actually be disadvantaged by everything open by default, and that's part of the important next phase of discussion. But I do also want to touch upon this notion around the David and Goliath Waterfront Toronto being steamrolled by Sidewalk Labs, which I think is a tremendous mischaracterization of this entire relationship that we have, because it's not just Waterfront Toronto and our staff. We have the backing and the strength of all three levels of government. So it's not Waterfront Toronto and Alphabet. It's the Government of Canada, the Province of Ontario, the City of Toronto, and Waterfront Toronto.
Sidewalk Labs will not speak for any of the companies or partners that it brings into this project with regards to the ownership of data. They've been quite clear that Mr. Doctoroff has been quite clear in saying he can't speak for the other technology companies that will be part of this project.
I would agree with you, he can't, but we can make those requirements incumbent upon any other third party that would be participating in our Smart City initiative, similar to how we've done in our development agreements, where we've put in some core requirements for things like what Meg mentioned earlier around LEAD or our intelligent community initiatives with regards to connecting to high-speed networks and doing digital inclusion projects. So there are ways that Waterfront Toronto and its government stakeholders can be protected and protect the Canadian economy by actually putting those measures in place as Waterfront Toronto.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up for 5 minutes, Madame Fortier.
Alors, je voudrais juste partager.
I want to share my time with Nate, please. Oh.
Thanks very much. So just one last follow-up to my original questions. So when you've got Professor Skaza, and who has been involved in on the board, you've got Ms. Kavukian, who was involved on the board and stepped away. Both of whom are, including Mr. Geist, but both of those two have been very serious privacy advocates, and would even say I think our committee's maybe not gone as far in our recommendations as we maybe could have. Are you comfortable now with the commitment to de-identification and subsequent conversations with Ms. Kavukian that they're supportive of the path forward?
Absolutely.
And with respect to Civic Data Trust, are you familiar with the Toronto Region Board of Trade's proposal for the Toronto Public Library to be responsible for a Civic Data Trust?
Yes, I am.
And do you think that is a model worth considering? Is that a model you're looking at seriously?
So we're doing some work right now actually with the Mars Solution Lab about Civic Data Trust, since this has been tabled actually early on in the Quayside project. So one of the first phases that we've looked at is doing a Civic Data Trust primer so that we can build civic literacy around this concept so people can engage in that conversation, since it is relatively new in the Canadian environment. The Board of Trade report tabling the notion of a library playing that very critical role is actually quite compelling. Libraries have always played a very vital role as sort of the keeper of the universe of knowledge in cities. That being said, there's other options. There could be a notion around a sort of post-secondary model where a university or college becomes Switzerland of data brokerage, if you will, in the community, the municipality themselves. And I think civic data trusts offer one potential governance model, and there's others that we need to look at as well once we understand more fulsomely what is actually being contemplated for this area.
And with that in mind, then, in answer to a previous question, you committed to, however this moves forward, that de-identification at source to protect privacy would be mandatory. Is there a similar commitment to ensuring that the collection of data, the use of the data itself, is open and publicly accessible and under public control?
Yes, and actually going even further than that, the entire architecture being created in such a way that is open so that we don't end up with the dominance of one market player.
And so in the Toronto Region Board of Trade's report, they note organizational capacity remains a challenge for Waterfront Toronto with respect to data governance. And you're not really in the business of managing the data governance piece of a project like this, or at least historically not so. Whatever ultimate deal is reached, whether it's the Sidewalk Labs proposal or something else, if a smart city is in mind, there's going to be a data governance piece to the smart city. So what is presumably you're not waiting for Sidewalk Labs to propose a civic data trust. You say there are other options that you're considering. What is the path forward with respect to managing data and building a data trust?
So I think there's a few very important elements that we're putting in place. Initially DSAP was a bit of a stopgap to make sure that we had perspectives actually informing us as the project moved forward. We've just recently undertaken to recruit a new position within the corporation that in the next few weeks we'll be able to mention who we've hired, and they'll be filling the role of a manager of digital governance to help be the linchpin on this very important topic. But ultimately, Waterfront Toronto has never seen itself playing the role of the data keeper, the digital overseer of this project. We very much look to the City of Toronto and the other government authorities to be the part of that equation. It could be very much that the City of Toronto is, in fact, the one who takes the entire leadership piece on the digital piece moving forward. We, much like what we've done with our intelligent community component, are setting a sort of strategic position and some underlying conditions and creating enabling infrastructure for digital. But in this particular piece, I don't think Waterfront Toronto has ever asserted in any public forum in any way that we would be the ones who would be the keepers of the data.
which makes sense given capacity issues and resources and expertise. With respect to the master plan that is to be made public and additional consultations, with respect to that plan, there will be a path forward laid out there with respect to data governance?
Correct. So I think what's important to keep in mind is the conversation that's been happening thus far actually precedes what would normally be Waterfront Toronto's consultation process. Usually our consultation process starts after a proposal is received. So in that path moving forward, in addition to our civic labs, we're looking at having a very specific consultation piece around digital governance. The City of Toronto is also looking at their own consultation piece writ large on the Master Innovation and Development Plan, which will have a digital component to it as well. So there will be ample opportunity to hear concerns from citizens on the digital components.
So I think I've got two more questions. One is with respect to the hypothetical case studies that Sidewalk Labs put in their October 2018 report. And the one example is pedestrian counters, and Sidewalk Labs has inserted themselves as the potential submitting an application, and the Data Trust publishes the RDIA, and the information presumably is publicly available. But the second case study is actually Startup A, a small Canadian startup, and because the small Canadian startup requires the ability to monetize, given they're putting money into the project initially, the idea is that they would be able to monetize the data. It would be proprietary for a period of time. And then it says, after a time, the data is made freely and publicly available. Now, that makes a certain degree of intuitive sense to me, but then the question I have is, who decides when that data becomes publicly available? And so, do you have a view of that as far as it goes, or that's also
time
what
is,
we're going to...
is well past, so just a brief answer, if you can.
We don't have a fully developed answer on that, and that's one of the pieces we actually want to speak with the small business community in Canada about what they would be looking towards that. And in particular, Curtis McBride, for instance, from Mile Vision, who's on the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel, his insights would be very valuable in that piece as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Angus for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been sitting at this table for 15 years. I used to be young and good-looking and have dark hair. And the one thing Thank you, Frank. It's just because we're the same age. In
front of me there?
Taking my time, Speaker. Call him out. When I see questions from the Auditor General, I have to ask those questions. I mean, that's, an Auditor General raises a red flag. That's a red flag. So my question is in terms of the negotiations at the federal level. When did John Broadhead get involved in the conversation? Was that prior to the framework agreement?
I'm not aware of any conversations with John Broadhead. There was the email that you mentioned, and that's the thing that I didn't get to say. That email was about scheduling the Prime Minister, the Premier, the Mayor, and the head of one of the largest corporations in the world. A very tough thing to schedule. That wasn't about selecting Sidewalk. It wasn't about pressuring.
I understand that. I just wanted to know when he was getting involved, because the Auditor General noted that said that matters that should have been handled by formal consultations with other levels of government, obviously, to me, the city should have been really involved. It says, were instead, quote, discussed at a senior political level. So was that senior political level at the federal level?
I don't know anything about that.
Well, that was in the Auditor General's report.
I don't know anything about discussions at the senior...
Okay, because she was concerned. She raised that flag, because I think, to my colleague, Mr. Vaughan, certainly many of these issues are city issues, and she was concerned at how that consultation process hadn't gone down. Just the other thing that the Auditor General said, and I'm just a little confused here, because you said it was a 156-day RFP?
He said 159.
159. The Auditor General said it was only 6 weeks. And she said that it was 10 weeks for an art installation project and the waterfront. And she said that... she agreed that Sidewalks Lab was given the go-ahead because it was the most comprehensive, but this was because that she says they were given preferential treatment even well in advance of the RFP. So that's why it went ahead. So if the Auditor General believes it's 6 weeks, why didn't you explain to her that she was wrong?
So, Mr. Chair, if I can address that. The Auditor General's 6-week time period actually relates to what would be the equivalent of a pre-qualification period. The full 159 days is the full duration of the RFP process, including what is the best and final offer process of the submission.
The Auditor General know that? I mean, she's a pretty smart lady, eh? Like, she raised this as one of the issues.
This was a very complicated issue to explain to her because it followed a very different model in terms of the terminology that was being used.
I guess she didn't get it. Like, this is her job, and she said that Sidewalk Labs was given preferential treatment, that this conversation began in 2016, long before the RFP went out, so they were prepared for this, and that she said, compared to an art installation, that this was a very short RFP.
No, Mr. Chair, this was actually 159 days. The first phase of that submission was only the 6 weeks that was referred to, but the entire process was 159 days. That is a fact on our records. It's the second longest RFP process that we have ever run as a corporation. With regards to any element of...
Auditor General on that? Because, I mean, it's in all the papers, and I just think if the Auditor General doesn't know what she's talking about, you should have been correcting the record.
I wouldn't say the Auditor General does not know what she's talking about. You know, her and her staff were extraordinarily competent when they worked with Waterfront Toronto. We have no inkling of anything otherwise. But I also want to touch upon the preferential treatment component of it. The Auditor General pointed to a number of different pieces of information that we shared with a variety of different individuals, different companies that were through the market sounding process. Sidewalk Labs was well into that market sounding process of the 50 plus companies that we spoke to. The information that she had pointed to were exhibits that were in the flood protection due diligence report, which was publicly available. There was publicly available websites, including links to the economic development site of City of Toronto.
You did give information to others, but she said you gave more and preferential treatment to them. So that was what she said.
That was her interpretation.
That was her interpretation. Okay, thank you.
We're at time. I believe there was one more question from Mr. Erskine-Smith. Go ahead.
We had Taylor Owen before us talking about social media platforms and regulating social media platforms, and he mentioned the monetization model of personal information is one of the causes of some of the negative externalities we see with respect to social media and the massive collection of personal information. Now this, as I understand it, you've said it's not a traditional monetization model using personal information. That accords with what I've read in the documents. So this isn't a traditional Alphabet, Google way of making money. They are a straight-up development company in this proposal?
I wouldn't say that they're a straight-up development company. There's actually three sort of approaches to revenue streams that they looked at early on. We're not sure where that will fit within their overall business proposal to us. There was the real estate component, an infrastructure component, and then the intellectual property component of it. We don't know how that blends out and mixes out, but it isn't the traditional Google play.
Questions for them, not for you, though.
Right.
And I think, I'm not sure if colleagues of mine had additional questions, but that's all for me.
Is there... and I have one with Mr. Vaughn. That's not one speaking slot. That's one question and one question.
Yeah, I guess that's the question I want to ask. Are we going for another full round? Because if we're going for a full round, I'm happy not to go. But if we're going to continue with questions,
that was the understanding. There was one last question. So we have, target time we aim for on Thursdays. So, Mr. Erskine-Smith, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sorry. I thought it was 5 minutes, and then it was going to be.
Yeah, well, we can split up to 5. That's fine.
Yeah, so I would say if it's split as between, if Charlie wants to take a question and...
I'm happy.
Okay.
If that's one last 5 minute, then I think that's easy to manage. So who would you like to go first? Mr. Vaughn, go ahead. For the remainder of the time, I believe, is 4 minutes.
So consultation was actually done before the proposal was received.
That's correct. It's called a market sounding, and it's a very common practice.
That consultation was also a public consultation as you move forward, taking a look at the site in conjunction with the City of Toronto's planning department, as well as with public stakeholders along the waterfront.
Absolutely. In fact, there was a lot of planning already in place for the Quayside site and also the Portlands long before the RFP.
And how many weeks of consultation have you done before a deal is even firmly on the table? In other words, how much public consultation has happened before there's even a deal to do? Project?
Well, we've been out in the public now for 18 months, and we have quite a number of months still ahead of us.
And after the deal is presented publicly to Waterfront Toronto, will there be more public consultation?
Yes, absolutely.
That is actually one of your hallmarks.
Yes, it is.
In fact, the complaint often is you consult too much.
It does take us a little longer sometimes, but we try to get it right.
In terms of the Auditor General's report, the Auditor General report that the member opposite is embracing, the Auditor General's report also suggests that this entire project, all 300 acres, should be done by charity. And they cite Millennium Park in Chicago as the high watermark of waterfront development and suggest that Waterfront Toronto, instead of using government funds, should get donations to build the LRT, donations to build the water parks, donations to build the parks, donations to build infrastructure, that the entire 300 acres should be done on charity. Do you support the Auditor General's finding that this entire, the most important real estate in the country, I would argue, should be done by charitable foundation and not by government?
I don't actually recall that in the AG report, but what I would say is that we are certainly looking into philanthropic opportunities for things like public spaces. I don't know if there's an example anywhere in the world where donations, philanthropy has been used to build infrastructure such as LRT.
And just to a final thing, nothing gets built here, nothing gets approved here, and no infrastructure is touched unless the City of Toronto approves.
That's correct.
And there's nothing the federal government can do to change that.
To my knowledge, that's correct.
And so this is a project that is funded federally, funded provincially, funded municipally, but at the end of the day, governance is given to the City of Toronto.
The final approvals on any land use, building permits, et cetera, is all the City of Toronto, and any land transactions and any infrastructure.
Not one penny of tax dollars to pay for an LRT can be raised, collected, or spent by Google, or Alphabet City, or Sidewalk Labs without the full consent of the City of Toronto, and only the City of Toronto can provide that consent under the provincial planning law.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Looks like we're done. So I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing today, and Mr. Paquette for being out in TV land. Have a good weekend, everybody. We're adjourned.